Hi, hello, and welcome on in for another segment of Cooking with Rambo. This week we're making pork chop marsala. Now I more commonly make chicken marsala, but it's the same premise just with pork chops. So I've got our discounted pork chops there, some mushrooms, garlic, onion. I unfortunately don't have chicken broth, so we're using bouillon cubes to make my chicken broth, spaghetti, flour, and marsala wine. Those are the ingredients that we are going to need in order to make this week's meal prep dish. Hopefully our camera angles and everything should be a little bit more cooperative this week. I did only do 2 rather than trying to do 3 like I did last week, so there might still be a little bit of lag and having to restart cameras, but hopefully it's at least a bit more smooth than last week's was. We're continuing to learn from this process, and I've already recorded the video for next week, and it definitely looks a lot smoother. So we're just going to continue to learn from our mistakes and grow and just see where all of this takes us. So let's go ahead and get on into the cooking. First things first is we're going to want to clear a lot of this stuff aside. We're going to do a lot of the pre-prepping, cutting that we need to do before we even start worrying about cooking anything. So you can see I already have a knife there, and I probably should have used a larger knife again, but I defaulted to this knife like I usually do. And we're going to grab a cutting board, and we're going to go ahead and go into our onion here. So the first step, of course, is to cut a little bit off of the top and bottom. That way we can peel the skin off of our onion. And then we're just going to go ahead and slice and dice this one. We're not julienning them like we did last week. It's straight up slice and dice, because these are going to get sauteed up with the mushrooms. That little pause there was just me grabbing my trash bag. If you are someone who has a yard and can compost, go for it. Compost these pieces that you're pulling off of the onion. I don't, so we're just throwing it straight into the trash can, unfortunately. Now that we've got our onion all sliced and diced, I'm just sticking it off to the side in a bowl for now to be used later, because we're not going to worry about this until after we have pre-browned our meat and are ready to start making our actual marsala sauce. So just off to the side it goes. Now I am using 2 containers of mushrooms, but if you're not a fan of mushrooms and you don't like them, then by all means you can only use 1, or you can completely omit them from the recipe. You don't have to include them. This is just what's going to be considered my vegetable for the week, and I love fun, guys, so I'm going to go ahead and enjoy my mushrooms. I did dump the bin out to go through and see if any of them were super thick slices, and if they were, I'm slicing them additionally to that, because I want them to be able to very easily saute up with these onions, rather than having to wait a little while for the mushrooms to saute up as well. But if you prefer not to have them, or you prefer like having whole chunks, do what you will. It's all up to personal preference, as we kept mentioning last weekend. I'm just going ahead and repeating this process with the second tub of mushrooms. Friendly little reminder that this video is in real time, so you are seeing exactly how long it took me to meal prep 6 lunches of the chicken marsala. I believe I got 6 out of it. I may have only got 5. We'll see by the end of it. But this is all completely real time, so with all of the prep and all of the actual cooking and all of the packaging, it took me a little less than an hour to get this done. So not super long, but if you're someone who doesn't have enough time in the day, then you may feel like you don't have time to meal prep. I make sure I set aside at least 2 hours, if not a bigger window for meal prepping, because I do also usually meal prep at breakfast as well. This week, we unfortunately are not. I did have something in mind, and then I decided to just use what frozen items I had in the refrigerator and freezer to go ahead and just eat those for breakfast. And then I also have cereal that I ate during the week too. So tons of different options for breakfast that I just didn't feel the need to meal prep this week. Alright, now that we have pre-sliced and diced all of our onions and peppers, we're going to go ahead and start getting into the actual pork chop portion. Now, these 2 containers of pork chops are 2 completely different types of pork chops. One of them is boneless and one of them is bone-in. So I did go through, you can technically leave the bone in to make pork chop marsala, but I didn't want to have to struggle with the bone during my work lunch period. So I'm going in and I'm pre-cutting the major portions of meat off of the bone here. Now, I promise you, I am not wasting the portions that I left on the bone. I do end up going and cutting some of the bigger pieces off as well to use. And then I actually cooked these up and just gnawed on the bone myself to get the rest of it off, which you're not going to see here. But this is why I'm cutting around the bone here. I want to make sure that it's a lot easier for me at work when I'm eating my lunch, that I don't have to worry about having a knife, or what am I going to do with the bone, or having a plate to be able to cut the bone out and things like that. So I'm just pre-cutting it here. It saves me time later on, even if it takes a little bit of time here. So do with it as you will. If you'd rather leave it with the bone in and you're having it for dinner, by all means go for it. But meal prepping ways, it's going to be a lot easier for me to cut the bones out. And then these other portions of pork chops that I found on clearance don't even have the bones, so they're already preset and ready for me to go. I know some people don't like having the extra fat on the ends of their meat, so if you're someone who doesn't like having the extra fat, then I guess go ahead and cut the fat off. I like the extra flavor and juiciness having the fat on any type of meat brings to a recipe, so I just leave them on. A little bit of fat is not going to do you any harm. Yes, I know I'm a little bit on the bigger side, so maybe I should be cutting back on the fat on my meats. But there's a lot of other things I could be doing in my lifestyle to work on getting slimmer. I don't have to worry about cutting out fats as much if I didn't want to. The fat is not what's making me fat. It's the rest of my life. Now here I'm just doing a little bit of seasoning and patenting that seasoning. I'm using an everything seasoning. What that means is I've just gone ahead and I've used this container, which I believe I showed the label. It's a garlic pepper type mix. I go in and I customize it myself when it runs out. So it gets Italian seasoning, it gets garlic powder, it gets onion powder, it gets a teeny tiny little bit of salt, not a lot though. It gets pepper. And I go ahead and I just mix all of those items up and I use it on pretty much everything. Hence the name everything seasoning. So we're just coating these in that seasoning prior to us coating them in flour. And I like to dab it in a little bit, that way it sticks rather than it falling right off again. Now that they are seasoned and ready to go, I am taking a little Tupperware container and I'm putting some flour into here. Keep in mind, you are not going to be able to reuse this flour later on and put it back into this tub because that'll be cross-contamination. So whatever you put into this container, you're either using today or you're throwing away afterwards. So start with a little bit. You can add more later on if it's not enough. And then I'm also going to be taking some EVOO, which is extra virgin olive oil, and I'm going to be putting it into my pan. Yes, I know the stovetop camera is broken and you can see that blue line on it. I promise I fix it. It just takes me a hot second to recognize it. See? It's fixed. Good job. So there's a little bit of EVOO going into the pan here. And you're going to go ahead and turn it on to medium heat. And that way this is just starting to get that oil up to temperature for us to be able to sear our pork chops in the pan. And then all you're going to do here is you're going to end up taking a pork chop, flipping it and dipping it both sides into that flour so it is completely coated, and then sticking it on into the pan. Now, I preemptively pulled a plate off to the side. That way, once I am finished searing the meat, I have somewhere to stick it. You can opt to do multiple pork chops at once for this, or you can do them individually. That is completely up to you. I opted to just throw as many in as I could, because why not? I think I got 5 in on the first batch, and then I did 4 in on the second batch. That way it only took 2 turns of searing. But I could be wrong. I may have done 3 and 3 on this. But just however many you can fit into that pan, and make sure you're flipping them all and cooking them pretty evenly. We're going to be throwing them back into the sauce later on. So the main thing here is to get that nice crispy on the sides. But if you want to make sure that they are fully cooked, you can always cut into them afterwards or while they're cooking and make sure that the pork is completely cooked as well. Realistically, it should only be like 3 or 4 minutes on each side of these pork chops. Again, I'm not following any specific recipe, although I can link one below in the description. This is just me following how I was taught to do this. I did make chicken marsala the month previous, so I did have a little bit of insight on how long I was going to be cooking things. But different meats take different times to cook. So make sure that you are keeping an eye on it and double checking any information you're not sure of. And then once you feel as though that has been long enough, you're just setting it off to the side again for now, and we're going to get ready to throw our next 3 pork chops in. I did rinse it out and knock some of the gunk out in between these sets here because I didn't want to have to worry about all those crumbs burning up. So I just rinsed it quickly in the sink and pat dried it. But I'm adding more EVOO in, and it's going to heat right back up again, and then I'm going to flour and throw in 3 more pork chops to cook. Now, at this point, I've also started prepping my water in the upper burner corner. That way, I have it getting ready to boil. I did add salt into the water for anyone who has cooked before. Salt is just going to help differentiate the boiling temperature and how hot the water gets. So I added a little bit of salt, and then once that starts to really boil, I will go ahead and I will add the spaghetti into that pot. Now the camera is starting to flicker again. Don't worry, I will notice and I will attempt to fix it. The main reason that this is happening with this camera is because of the fact that I have it positioned over top of the stovetop. So the heat is starting to radiate off of what I'm cooking and going up towards the camera, and it's making it freak out just a little bit. Unfortunately, that's not something I have too much control over at the moment. I would just need to get a better quality camera. That way, maybe I could post it up higher and it doesn't have as much heat coming off the stove towards it, or maybe put it at a different angle and zoom it in. I don't have the equipment to do that at the moment, so we just keep working with what we got, y'all. We can do it. We'll get through it. And now we're on to our last batch of 3 pork chops here, and we're just going to keep doing the same thing, flouring both sides, putting it into the pan. Yes, I did add a little bit of EVOO again in between. If you still have a lot of grease in the pan, you don't have to worry about adding more, but I did because I could see that it was getting a little bit dry. You can also add more EVOO after putting the pork chops in, which I believe I also ended up doing. It's totally fine. It's not going to ruin the fact that you have flour on it at all. And I'm just going ahead and moving more things off to the side here so the cutting board can go straight into the sink, but I think I'm rinsing it off and putting it up to dry already rather than leaving it sit in my sink. And then again, friendly reminder, you cannot put that flour back into the container. So that flour is going to get thrown away. I would wait until after we finish making the sauce to throw it away though, because you are going to end up using a little bit of flour to help thicken up that Marsala wine into a sauce. So just hold on to it for now, but do not put it back into its storage container, okay? Don't do it. It's cross-contamination. You're going to ruin all of your flour that way. Now, since I didn't have any chicken broth to use with my marsala sauce, I'm making my own chicken broth. All you have to do is take some chicken bouillon cubes and some hot water, and you're going to break up the cube chunks and you're going to mix it into the water. It's not going to be a perfect chicken broth consistency compared to what you would buy fully already mixed. And honestly, if you were making regular chicken marsala, you could have also tried boiling your chicken bones to get some of the chicken broth if you wanted to. But I'm just going ahead and doing what I can with what I have, and we're going to end up using that in the broth. Now I'm flipping my last couple pork chops here, getting them ready to pull off and add to the plate. And then once those are completely done, we're going to pull them off to the side as well, and we're going to start digging into our actual marsala sauce and all of the sauteing of the onions and mushrooms and such. So hang tight. The first thing we are going to do is obviously add our onions and mushrooms in to saute them. Now, I add them both in at separate times, but you could add them in at the same time if you wanted to. I just know for a fact that mushrooms don't take nearly as long to saute up as onions usually do. So I'm going ahead and caramelizing the onions before I bother adding in the mushrooms. I also know that I like a little bit of crunch to my mushrooms even after I've sauteed them up. So again, I want less time of them sauteing up. While I'm letting the onions go, I'm getting my garlic ready. I did make a little bit of a mess as I was trying to move the homemade chicken broth out of the way, so I have to clean that up very quickly here. It's not a huge deal. It's literally just chicken broth, guys. It's fine if you make a mess. That's what happens when you're learning and you're cooking. But I'll go right back into playing around with the garlic in a second. And again, if anyone was paying attention last week, my technique for peeling a garlic is to flip it upside down on the countertop and then use the heel of my hand to go ahead and apply pressure. And this usually gets it to pop so that most of them are already pre-peeled, and I don't have to worry about digging my nails into it to peel the skin off. But if there's a different way you prefer to do this, if you have one of those fancy gadgets, by all means, go for it. They do also sell pre-peeled cloves of garlic. I like getting the fresh 5-pack of the full things of garlic. It's usually cheaper that way too. And then this way, I don't have to worry about the garlic going bad while it's sitting in my fridge waiting for me to use it. Not that it takes too long for me to use garlic. Garlic goes into everything. At this point, I have officially added my mushrooms into our little pan here, and I'm snacking on them as we go because, again, I love mushrooms and I love snacking on them. They're a really good thing to just have sitting around. I love them with some Thousand Island. And then there are a couple different ways you could add your garlic into your recipe here. Last week, I actually used one of those little grating trays. You could use that again if you wanted to. I'm opting to add in full slices of garlic. This is going to give me a whole piece of garlic when I'm eating my dish later on to just really get that flavor in. Either way, you're going to have a garlic taste to your dish. I just decided that this was the method I wanted to use. So add your garlic whatever way you feel best. Add as many as you feel are necessary. I believe I added in just about all of these ones that I had peeled the skin off of. So it's another one of those personal preference things. Do with it as you will. And then once we've got all of these starting to saute up, we're going to get ready to eventually add in our Marsala wine, or a cooking wine if you want. You can also just use a traditional red wine. Good lord, words. I ended up using a very classic red wine. It was cheap enough that I got a really nice big bottle to stick into my storage cabinet for the next time I decide to make Marsala. But if you're not someone who cooks with wine very frequently, you can also just go to any grocery store and they have cooking wine. Now, if you're concerned about there being alcohol in the dish, don't. When you're cooking with alcohol, most of those properties burn off. You don't have to worry about your drinking alcohol while you're cooking, unless you want to, but I'm not endorsing that. You can make tons of different recipes using liquors, such as vodka rigatoni. That's another good staple that I love, and I would love to be able to show you guys that one day, but that is a process. So don't worry about feeding this to your kids. It's fine. They're not going to experience any negative effects from it, I promise. Now, I don't know if anyone's noticing up in the upper corner there, but I am adding my spaghetti to its pot of boiling water. I am also taking the time to break the spaghetti in half. This is just, again, to make it easier for me when I am eating my lunch at work. Nothing wrong with having full-size noodles, but I also know for a fact that I don't like sitting in the office slurping my pasta up and having people hear me do that. I am not a fancy girl. I slurp my pasta. Thank you. So I'm just breaking it in half preemptively to save me that hassle later. Yes, you can purchase pasta that is already cut into that half size length, but it's usually more expensive. So save yourself a couple of cents and just break the pasta in half. It's not hard to do, guys. If you're also someone who'd rather just cut it later on using a knife or a fork or scissors or whatever, you do you, boo. You do you. I'm breaking it preemptively because this is easiest and it takes a couple seconds. So at this point, I am adding the flour into the pan here and I am flipping everything around in the pan. I want to make sure that all of my mushrooms and my onions are completely coated in this flour prior to me adding in my marsala wine and my chicken broth. The reason I am doing this is because I want to make sure that this flour gets evenly distributed among the sauce that we're doing because it's going to help thicken it up. And I could have actually added in the wine first if I wanted to, but then I may have ended up with clumps later on. So this is a really nice, easy way to make sure I'm not getting as many clumps by having it stick to the mushrooms and onions instead. And then once the wine and the chicken broth gets added in, it will just come off of those items and thicken up the broth. Now, again, I am sure there is an exact science to how much of this to add on in any recipe, but I'm not looking at a recipe. I'm going based off of my gut and how I was taught to cook. So once I finally manage to get this bottle open, I'm just going to go ahead and pour a bunch of this into there until I think it's enough. Look, I'm trying to show you the wine. It's Barefoot brand, not sponsored. Pinot Noir. Go ahead and tell me I butchered the name. I don't care. I'm Americano. We butcher everything. So I'm just adding it in, and then I'll add the chicken broth in. I do eventually add more wine in as well because I know what it's meant to taste like. So I take a little taste of the sauce, and it's not winey enough for what I know it's meant to taste like. So I end up adding more on later on. But do it whatever way you feel comfortable. If you want to use an exact recipe, use an exact recipe. If you're like me and go based off of taste, go off of taste. Again, you do you, boo. It's all about learning here. We're learning. Now, I add a little bit of milk in there just to make it a little bit creamier, and then I'm also adding in some more seasoning because I never actually seasoned any of the mushrooms and onions and such. So I'm just adding that little bit of extra seasoning to my stuff, and you're just going to keep mixing it and making sure that everything is getting a really nice even texture, everything is cooking well together. And if you want to, you can turn the heat down a little bit at this point. I left it on medium heat, though, for most of this because I am keeping a really close eye on it and I am constantly stirring. If you're working on multiple things at once, you can go ahead and turn the heat down. It's fine. It's just going to simmer a little bit. And then once I've got this to the consistency that I want, I am leaving it a little bit on the thicker side because I know when I reheat it in the microwave at work, it's going to be a little bit thinner and a little bit more watery, just because there's going to be extra water leaving the pork when I microwave it. So I'm leaving it a little bit on the thicker side. Realistically, if you're making this for dinner, you want it a little bit thinner. You can add more milk to it, you could add more marsala wine to it, you could add more chicken broth to it, whatever you want to do, but you're definitely going to want this a little bit on the thinner side if you're serving it over the pasta to eat right away. And you'll actually see when I go to prep my dinner portion of this meal prep later on that I do leave some of it in the pan and add more liquid to loosen it up later. So, personal preference, but I know since I'm meal prepping this that I want to leave it a little bit on the thicker side. Y'all do you. Now, you should occasionally be finding time to stir your pasta as well. You don't want it to be sticking to the bottom of your pot and burning. If you want to use a completely separate utensil for this, you're more than welcome to. I opt to just use the same utensil because it's all making the same meal anyway. And then once our sauce is ready to go, we can take our pork chops and you're going to put the pork chops into the sauce. Realistically, I probably should have used a bigger pan for this, but this is actually the biggest size pan I have with the exception of my wok. So we're just going to slide these in as best as we can without making a mess. You want to try and get them completely covered in the sauce. That way they're soaking in that flavor. And we're just going to leave these sit here for a couple of minutes. Now, at this point, I am turning the stove down to low because I do not want anything to burn because I am not going to be stirring this sauce nearly as much as I was when I was making it. I am instead letting everything sit and soak in. And all you saw me doing there just now was dripping some of the sauce, the grease or water, whatever moisture, whatever you want to call it, from the pork chops into this pan because it's going to add a little bit of extra flavor, and why waste that little bit of moisture? So I'm just putting it into the pan with everything, and I'm going to keep wiggling these around. That way everything gets completely coated to soak in that marsala taste. All right, and now it is time to actually prep the food. So apparently I decided to make 5 instead of 6 out of this. Now, if anyone remembers correctly, I did actually have like almost 10 pork chops. So I am going to end up putting about 2 pork chops into each of these meal servings. Depending on the size, realistically, let's be honest. Some of those ones that I cut off the bones weren't quite as big as the ones that were already pre-deboned. So I'm going to go based on the size of the pork chops, and I'm going to throw them in. And then I did end up taking those smaller ones off the bone and throwing them in when I made my dinner prep. So I ate those with my dinner as well. Now, the thought did occur to me after I started putting the pasta in that I probably should have put the pork chops in underneath and then put the pasta on top. But it doesn't really matter either way. It's still getting cooked and it's still getting eaten. So whatever your personal preference is. But I'm going ahead and I'm putting about a scoop and a half of this pasta into each of these containers. And then I'm going to go ahead after I have dished them all out into those containers. And I'm going to put the pork chops and the sauce on top of it. And then that's pretty much it. Your dinner is going to be ready to go, ready to eat. Enjoy! I hope it's just as delicious as you imagined it would be. And if it's not, then it's okay. You live and you learn, and you do it again the next time. Mine was perfectly fine, and I did eat this all throughout the week at work. And I also ate it for dinner, obviously. So, I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope this was very informative. There is a little bit of length left to the video, so stick around to keep watching what it looks like as I close up these containers. But that's pretty much it, y'all. You've successfully made a pork chop marsala, and I hope this was helpful to you. If there is a recipe you want to see me cook in the future, feel free to comment it below this video, and I will see if maybe it's something I can fit into my schedule. Keep in mind, though, that these videos are essentially recorded 2 weeks in advance, and then that gives me an entire week to make sure that I prep it and post it onto YouTube scheduled ready to go for y'all. So it might be a little while before I actually make whatever it is you're suggesting. And I do usually base my meal prep off of whatever discount items I can find in the store, because I do like to be a little savvy and use some discounted items because I'm a girly on a budget. But yeah, so you see I added 2 pork chops there. I'm adding 2 pork chops into this one, and I added 2 pork chops into each of these containers. Wham, bam, good to go, and then I will add some more of the sauce and mushrooms on afterward, because I want that little bit of extra for all of that pasta underneath. I don't just want to rely on what's on the pork chops here. There's all that wonderful extra goodness on top, and then this is the bit that's going to get left off to the side for me to eat for dinner, which again, I'm going to loosen up a little bit by adding some extra liquid to it. See here, I'm just literally adding water. Realistically, you would want to add more chicken broth instead of just straight water, but I wasn't about to use a whole nother chicken bouillon cube to make more chicken broth, so I just added water. It's fine. It's fine. And this is going to help loosen it up some. I may have loosened it up just a little bit too much, to be honest with you, but you can let it sit on the stove and it'll thicken itself back up again automatically. And here's those pork chops that I said I was adding in. No, I did not flour them because I already threw the flour into this recipe. But it's fine. It's the same premise. It's just pork chops, guys. It's okay. I promise. And there we have it, our wonderful chicken marsala. Feel free to go ahead and like the video if you liked it, dislike it if you don't. It'll show me what you do and don't like off of my channel. Subscribe to us if you want to see more content, and as always, have a wonderful rest of your week, guys. I'll see y'all next week for when we have some absolutely wonderful food ready to go for you. Next week is a chicken dish, in case you were curious.